Hi, hello, and welcome. This is my behind-the-scenes video for the making of the 3D models for Smokey the Apprentice and Mittens the Mighty for my Smile assignment this year. I'm not going to be showing the whole recordings for both of the making of Smokey and Mittens because that is actual hours of footage. So just to make sure I can actually get this out in time before the deadline, I'm breaking it down into chunks based off of like the stages of my workflow. So I'm going to be talking about the blockout with little clips from the blockout, and then the sculpt, and then the actual like retopology if I was doing anything like that, or polymodeling if that was the case, yada yada, so on until showing the final product. And considering how I'm obviously using the same techniques to make Smokey and Mittens, I'm going to be using a mix of clips from both of their process videos or recordings to show and like roughly explain what I did to make both of them. With that being said, I think I've rambled on for long enough now, so let's actually get into the main making of Smokey and Mittens. Okay, so first, before I get started with anything on the actual blockout side of things, I needed to get my references imported and ready. So this is me doing all of that, getting them imported as images and like actually setting them up as references in Blender, yada yada. And taking a bit to make sure that they were all up to scale and lined up with one another, and they all made sense from each angle. I decided to make Mittens first because if I wasn't able to get Smokey's model done in time for the deadline, then I'd still have the most important character of the short film done. At the time that I was making Mittens, I was really rusty with making 3D models, so I had to try and shake it off and remember and jog my memory of what my usual workflow was. Like, I still knew my bearings, but it's just getting it all fresh in my mind again, and that's also why I, for some reason, decided to start out with a really high poly UV sphere. I could not explain why I did this in hindsight. UV spheres, like the topology is so wacky, like at the tops and bottoms, the amount of tries, it would mess up anything I tried to make of it. And it's just way too much to work with for a blockout that's supposed to be simple and supposed to block out like the basic shapes of what you're trying to make. So I very quickly realized how dumb I was being, and I went back and just made a cube and put a subdivision modifier on it, which was so much easier to work with. To simply explain what subdivision does off the top of my head, it basically takes a face and divides it into halves or quarters to smooth out a model, make it more high resolution and higher poly. I personally like to use cubes with subdivision modifiers during the blockout phase because it gives me a lot of control, because subdivision modifiers keep the original topology of the mesh that's being affected by the subdivision modifier, and you can kind of use it and manipulate it as like a cage. It also gives me a really good base to work from when I eventually move on to sculpting. As I'm shaping the subdivided cube to match the rough shape of Mittens' head, I'm adding loop cuts with the Ctrl-R keybind every now and then whenever I need more detail. I mainly did a lot of the shaping of the head manually, but I also used the assistance of proportional editing every now and then, just so I could keep the rough shape of the head and make things go a little bit faster. Once I was satisfied with the rough shape of the head, I then moved on to making the ears with the same technique that I made the head for Mittens, just a simple cube with a subdivision modifier on it. And since the ears obviously have to be on each side of the head, I added a mirror modifier, which just mirrors your mesh on your selected axis. That way I could make and see both of Mittens' ears whilst only having to edit one. Another shortcut that I use quite often is edge slide. It's a nice way to clean up my topology without messing up the shape of my blockout. Instead of manipulating the cage of the subdivided mesh directly, I opted to use the sculpt tool here instead. It was a nice and quick way to adjust the shape of the ears without having to be too intimate with it. And here, I'm extruding the bottom of the ears down to the mesh for the head, so that when I eventually join and remesh the two, they'll effectively merge into one model seamlessly. I'm not caring too much for the topology in this stage of the process because, like I said before, I'm planning to remesh this whole block out, sculpt it a lot more, and then go back over the sculpt and do some retopology so that I can actually optimize the amount of polygons the model has. Just so that if I was able to get around to animating these models next year, it wouldn't explode whatever poor PC I'm using to do so. Here I've added another cube with a mirror and subdivision modifier to add little extra bits of detail and definition to the ears, like where it curves round. I'm adding this definition now during the blockout phase just so it's a little bit easier for me later on during sculpting. To be honest, I think I've explained enough of my rough blockout process, because I'm basically just repeating the same thing with every single part of the blockout. Like for the neck, it's another subdivided cube. For the muzzle, I've just added another subdivided cube and phased it inside the head and tried to recreate the rough shape of the muzzle as best as possible. It's just the same thing, rinse and repeat until I'm satisfied. Also, so I don't have to add a million loop cuts to get the rough cylinder shape of the neck, I just used the mean crease setting, just so that the cage of the subdivided model would actually affect it a little bit more, if that makes sense. And also, before we move on, I want to say that to save time, I ended up reusing the basic blockout for Mittens to start off Smokey. Although I still ended up editing the blockout quite a bit for Smokey, using Mittens' rough blockout as a starting point really helped me get this done fast. Especially since working on Mittens helped me get the rust stuff. Here's also a quick look at the making of the blockout for the paws of both Mittens and Smokey. Alright, I think that's enough yapping about the blockout phase for Mittens and Smokey, so here are some freeze frames of what the final blockouts looked like for them both, and with that being said, let's move on to sculpting. Before I got started with sculpting, I needed to make the model more high poly. So to do that, I selected each subdivided cube that I'd made, combined them with Ctrl-J, which basically just joins every single mesh together into one, and then I added a remesh modifier to that model. By remeshing everything, I could make the mesh as high poly as I needed to get the amount of detail I wanted from sculpting, and I could join everything together seamlessly like I'd said before. That's why I extruded the ears down into the head so that then when I did this part of the process, everything would link together. Here I'm smoothing out any harsh edges or bumps with the smooth tool, which enables any time you hold shift in sculpt mode. Also, while I'm working, I have mirror editing enabled on the x-axis, so that everything stays symmetrical. I also set up 2 extra views from the front and side angles that I could reference in real time while I was sculpting. This made my workflow just generally a lot faster. Though I do forget that they exist quite frequently, so if they're angled kind of weirdly or positioned kind of weirdly at certain points in the recording, then you know why. Now I've got the references for the front and side angles on hand at all times. I'm using those references to mark out where I want the eyes to be placed, and then I'm just using my general free camera view to carve them out more. And as I'm working, I'm checking how everything looks from each angle, just to make sure nothing looks too uncanny or misplaced. The brush I'm using to carve out the placement for the eyes is the clay strips tool, I believe, off the top of my head. I opted to use this tool for quite a while since I was able to add and take away a lot of material pretty fast. So once I was happy with the rough shape of the sculpt, I would then smooth out the clay strips. But this was also slowing me down as well because of how rough it looked. So for Smokey, I decided to opt to use the draw brush instead. After using this brush for quite a bit, I figured that it was getting along with me quite well, and the fact that everything looked fairly smooth from the get-go would really help me to figure out whether I was satisfied with the shape of the sculpt so far. Here I'm adding a UV spear to the scene, adding a mirror modifier to it, and shrinking it down and rotating it 90 degrees on the x-axis so it's pointing away from Smokey's face. And I'm just using those spears to give me a reference of where the eyes are going to be placed, so then it's easier for me to shape the sculpt around them. It took me quite a bit of messing about to get the eyes in a position that I liked for Smokey, but I didn't run into the same issue with Mittens, thankfully. The last voiceover I recorded should have also had a little jump scare warning in it, because Mittens looks horrifying right now. But I promise it gets better. I promise. I was rusty as all heaven, like, believe me, it gets better. I swear. And speaking of Mittens during their sculpt phase, I also used the snake hook tool to create the long hair on her face. This was really finicky to get right because the way I'd drawn her fur on the turnaround didn't exactly translate well in 3D, so I had to mess about with the placement of it in real time, basically. Eventually though, I was thankfully able to get Mittens looking the way I wanted her to, and she looked much less horrifying in the end. Another tool I'm using quite frequently here is the crease brush. Because I use the smooth tool quite a bit, I use the crease brush whenever I want to get some of the extra definition back. Another little shortcut I use quite frequently is holding control while I'm using a brush, because it essentially inverts what the brush does. You can enable a brush so it either adds or subtracts from a model, and control is a quick way to switch between that. I use that little shortcut quite a bit when I'm using the crease brush especially, because it's helping me to get these little risen edges that I'm adding to the tufts of fur on Mittens' face. I also use that same combination of the crease brush and holding control to get the right amount of definition for Mittens' eyelids and their nose and etc. I did also add the little tufts of fur on Mittens' ear the next day at college with the snake hook tool and whatnot, the same way I've done the fur on the bottom of Mittens' head, but that was all recorded on college computers and I have to go and download that from Google Drive to be able to show you that, and that, I don't know how long it's going to take me to download, so just for a little bit, I'm going to stick to showing you the process for Smokey, since it was all recorded on my computer and I have all of the files ready to go. Right, okay, that's another 7 minutes. I think that's enough yapping, so I'm going to move on to explaining the process for how I modelled Smokey's clothes, since I left the retopology until later on. I was struggling with getting the right shape for Smokey's head, so I decided to focus on everything else first to then come back to the sculpting phase with a fresh mind and a fresh, set of eyes, so I wouldn't be wasting time just staring at the sculpt unsatisfied. But Anyway, moving on to the poly modeling phase, or subdivision modeling, like you can call it multiple things. Just onto that phase. Okay, I do actually have to be real for a second. I don't really have that much time left to work on this video. This has taken me quite a bit longer than I'd hoped to edit all of this, so I'm gonna have to probably wrap things up after this next section, because not only am I running low on time, but my PC storage is hemorrhaging. This has taken up like 10 gigabytes worth of space somehow on my C drive. But yeah, unfortunately I'm not going to be able to cover everything, so I hope that's okay. I'm really sorry I haven't been able to finish this whole thing. Anyway, rambled enough. Let's get on to the next section. Okay, so the first part of the clothes I decided to model was his glasses. This was originally so that I'd have the glasses on hand as a reference so I could sculpt the head to suit them a bit better. To make the glasses, I added a plane to the scene, and I added a mirror modifier to it so I could edit both frames of the glasses while just editing one. The exact same thing that I did for the ears. I positioned the plane so that it was roughly in the right place for the frame, and then I extruded the plane inwards so that then I could delete the inner face and have an outline left over afterwards, and then I used that to make the frames with. I also added a solidify modifier to the plane so that the frames of the glasses would be the correct width. Also, here you can see me using vertex painting to recolor Smokey's sculpt, because I was having some troubles with telling apart the sculpt from the frames when I was trying to actually shape them. So just to make it easier to differentiate, I went and adjusted the color. It's a bit finicky to edit every single edge and point and face of a model directly, and that can sometimes mess up the actual flow of the topology if you're being too intimate. So for the sake of avoiding that, I put a subdivision modifier on the plane, and I'm just editing the cage again, so I can still get a fairly high-res model without having to be too intimate with every single little point. And it also just generally gives me a lot more control. Since the version of the glasses that I'm modeling now are going to be the final mesh of the glasses, as opposed to the sculpt for the head, I'm trying to not go overboard the topology, so I'm only adding loop cuts when absolutely necessary. Right, so I'm gonna skip ahead quite a bit here, because I want to give a proper example of how I usually do subdivision modeling before I move on. The way I modeled the glasses isn't the way I usually approach it. It was just because I needed a specific circular frame, or square frame in this case, to work with, so I extruded inwards when usually I like to make a plane and gradually work my way outwards with extruding the plane and extruding edges and adding faces and yada yada, just building it up slowly. And here you can see my mouse going from each view so that I can make sure that I'm modeling everything accurately to each view of the turnaround. I'm gonna compile a couple of highlights together just to make this a bit quicker, because it's all pretty straightforward, it's all pretty much the exact same process. So I'm just gonna show some highlights. In hindsight, I don't know why I decided to delete that entire loop of vertices. I don't know why I didn't just decide to select that entire loop of faces where the belt was supposed to be and just extruded it outwards, because that would have saved me all this poking and prodding around. Because I was trying to figure out how to get the topology right for having the part of the tunic separated at the bottom where it's coming down in like a little flaps, I guess, and to also have that come into the belt as well without it messing up topology, and it just generally would have saved me a lot of time, I think, but I was able to get it done either way. And I was also able to add Smokey's little belt buckle. This whole time, I've been trying my best to keep the mesh for this model, watertight. In a way, I'm pretty sure that's the right term. When I say watertight, I mean when there's no gaps or separate parts in a model. Like, every single part of the mesh's topology connects. Mittens' model, admittedly, isn't completely watertight. The little shoulder cape that they have isn't fully connected to their robes, and their neck isn't connected either. It was kind of hard for me to figure out how to connect those parts, and I've never truly known why people aim to make models watertight in the first place, but now I know. Now I know why. Because I was able to make the majority of Smokey's model watertight. Like, virtually all of their clothes are connected. Their bag is obviously separate, but their little tunic, like their sleeves, the cuffs of their sleeves obviously connected, but even their shorts, their leggings or tights, their little boots, it's all connected. And the only thing that isn't is Smokey's little neck brace. And I experienced how beautiful it was to be working with a watertight model during the waiting phase. Oh my god. It was compared to Mittens, it was a cakewalk. I have never had such a good time waiting a model before in my life, and I was fighting tooth and nail to avoid it. I had already accepted early on that I wasn't going to wait the models, and I'd be okay with just using the 3D models as a proof of concept in a way. But because I had quite a bit of time left after I'd finished the models entirely, like I had textured and fully finalized everything pretty early on in the day, so I figured that I'd actually have enough time to finish it. So Smokey was the first one I actually rigged, or waited, and it was a cakewalk. It was a breeze. It was mwah, gorgeous. So I was thinking, oh, surely Mittens would be the same, right? Guess what the survey says? I was so wrong. I was so wrong about how long it would take me, because you have to be so precise when you're weighting a model with separate parts, especially at the arms and like the shoulder area where you've got like millions of bones. You've got to like mess around with the weights of different it's so annoying. It was so annoying. It was doing my head in. That's why the pictures of Mittens like folding into themselves like a beach chair exist, because I was having to distort them into ways that they wouldn't normally move, just so I could see the most extreme of the extremes and weight them to be seamless, so in turn the smaller movements would have less noticeable clipping. It's just, it was such a nightmare. And Smokey is my favorite. Smokey is my golden child. Smokey is like, you're not supposed to pick favorites, but Smokey is, I'm biased solely because of how easy they were to weight, because not having to worry about the whole issue of there being separate parts while you're waiting is so nice. The only thing that I really struggled with was the bag and the little shoulder neck brace, but that's expected. It was a lot better than having to worry about it with like multiple, like the entire model virtually. It's like, but now I know for the future. Now I know. Now, in the future, when I make another 3D model, and I'm bound to because I love this, but in the future, when I make my next 3D model, I am going to fight tooth and nail to make the entire thing watertight if I can, because it would be such a blessing. It would be so nice. It would be so nice. But yeah, I just wanted to rant about that for a second. I went very off topic. Okay, to wrap things up, I would like to briefly touch up on retopology and whatnot, since that's one of the more complex techniques for this. So to try and sum up my process as quickly and as simply as possible, I used vertex painting to roughly mark out where I wanted my most prominent edge loops to be, and just to make sure I could get the topology I needed, because it's especially important to make sure your topology has the right flow with heads, because you need a lot of expressiveness in the face and whatnot, and to get the face to distort properly without it looking weird or without the topology looking odd, you need it to flow correctly. So that's why a lot of people advise before you go and do your retopology, you should mark out directly on the sculpt like where you want specific edge loops to be. So for places like the eyelids and the lips and the eyebrows and any other important bits like the nose, also, just, you get the gist. And for the record, I was doing this after I had fully finished my sculpt. I was doing this after I had gone back and made sure it was looking exactly how I wanted it to. Right, so now that all the important edge loops are mapped out, now we can actually get started with the retopology. It's pretty much the exact same process as subdivision modeling. Instead, this time you're projecting your faces directly onto the sculpt while you're modeling. I started out by adding a plane to the scene and merging all of the points of the plane together so it was just a vertice. To do this, I just used the M shortcut to open up the merge menu. From there, I extruded the point around the first curve I drew out around the eyelid and tried to make it line up as best as I could. Then, once I had that loop of vertices looking right, I extruded the entire thing outwards, so I could then try and make it line up with the pink curve that I drew out. I then extruded the vertices by the bridge of Smokey's nose into the middle so I could actually form that bridge, and then I just started working my way out to more loops and trying to form all of them, and eventually bridging them together. It's all pretty straightforward again. It's just marking out all of the loops with vertices and then bridging them together and slowly expanding them outwards to form the entire head. It's important to do the topology for the edge loops first, as opposed to anything else, because those are the parts of topology that need to be present in the final model. They're the most important parts of the topology, so you can improv everything else pretty much off of the existing topology from the edge loops, but you can't really go back and add them afterwards. It just saves a lot of time to do them beforehand and then extrude your way outwards to form the rest of the head. This is going to be another little highlights compilation of the key parts of the topology process for Smokey, and I did basically this exact same thing for Mittens. The only regret that I have with Mittens was that their retopology was more high resolution or higher poly than I hoped it would have been. Because I was rusty when I was making Mittens, and I didn't really know how much topology to be using in this phase before subdividing the retopology so that it's smooth and whatnot, I didn't really know how much to use, so I didn't want to undercompensate and make the model too low poly, because that wasn't what I was aiming for at all. Anyway, I don't want to accidentally go on another tangent again, so here's the montage. I'll add little comments every now and then, but this is the focus at the minute. Okay, we're just about done with the montage of all the topology, and I will say this is where I'm going to be wrapping it up. It is getting late, and I do need to get dinner, and it's not like I'm not going to have time to fit the rest of the process in. So I'm really sorry that I'm cutting this short, but I hope this was enough explanation to give like a general idea of how everything went. So yeah, that's about it. I might finish up this video next year as some kind of little pastime thing or as an extra assignment, but I'm not too sure how that would really work out. And I do honestly just need a break. So yeah, that's just about everything. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.